gets a goal? Who got the assist? Who got the assist?
Hello, so welcome to Who Got the Assist. It's season 6 for us, and we came back on there last week for our initial intro pod to the season, bit of re-intro to us, a bit of strategic chat, etc., etc. So if you haven't caught up with that, do go back and check that out. It was really good fun to just get going again. It won't invalidate this pod at all, but just note that we obviously didn't have the prices back then when that was recorded. We do now, though. Yes, last Tuesday, the floodgates opened and FPL launched for the 2022-2023 season, as moans of launch the game gave way to moans about not getting the low ID and how it's already too damn template. This pod is the pricing pod, one that I look forward to and also fear a bit in pre-season. A lot of work goes into it, but equally it's really enjoyable work. And hopefully in what I imagine will be a heavily edited final cut, you'll find our insights handy while you're drafting your team for the millionth time this July. I'm joined once more by new co-host Lucy. How are you doing?
I'm all right, thank you. How are you?
Very, very warm. Very, very warm indeed.
Everyone's very warm. The attic has turned into an oven. But yes, ignoring the melting, I have my notes ready to go. We are Who Got the Assist. You can find Tom on the main account at WGTA_FBL. And you can find me, Lucy, at Lucy Hynett with 2 T's. On the pod today, as Tom said, we'll be doing some idea of potential price structures and our thoughts on that. And then the big one, the price analysis. Don't all cheer at once. Structured by position and price tier in each of those positions.
Yep, and it is Monday, the 11th of July. There'll be new signings. Indeed, there are new signings today, which kind of changed the nature of the notes a bit, and some sales may have occurred, and other things may have happened in pre-season. If you're listening in the future, just remember this is the 11th of July we're recording on. So, yeah, the game has opened. A bit of a kind of template has emerged. I don't think we're going to talk about that too much, but I mean, we've started touching, Lucy, on team structure and things like that last pod. Has anything changed for you? What sort of things are you thinking at the moment? I know you haven't looked at it too much, have you, in terms of drafting?
I've kind of committed to what we briefly discussed last time, which was the 4-4-2 with a bit of kind of flexibility where you've hit the key price point. So I think probably looking at 4 premium defenders, some kind of cheap defender to sit on your bench. Salah, well, in my case, I can see some people going for Son, probably that kind of £8 million midfield spot, which we'll probably unpack in more, and then a couple of cheaper options. Then I currently have Jesus and Haaland up front. So that's kind of how I'm working at the moment. I think it's probably quite similar to a lot of teams.
Yeah, same. So looking at team structure, I really think, as I put on Twitter the other day, that the fun spots actually are the 4th defender, the 2nd to 4th midfielder, because you're going to have Salah, and the 2nd forward, because you're probably going to have Haaland. The goalkeeper and defence, I can't see myself changing too much. I've got Raya. I know there's been some Brentford transfer news today, but I don't think that's going to change anything too much. Trent, Cancelo, one of James and Chillers at the back, Salah in midfield and Haaland. And then the 4 to 4.5 defender, midfielder, the forward. That core looks pretty solid. I know that Perisic is currently in the template. I haven't investigated the freemium yet still, and we'll to see how that goes really, but it's just something that's going to develop over time as preseason happens. You've already seen it. Someone's done a goal in a preseason game. Suddenly he's essential. Rashford suddenly playing a game for Man United. Oh, suddenly he's essential now. But I do want to reiterate quickly, and I'm sure Lucy will attest to this too as a cautious manager by rote, that the template isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I say this every year. The players being honed in on this year, reinforced by OFPL tweeting the highest owned players and also the scout picks, which is basically the template, are there for a reason. So just check your urge to be contrarian and feel like you know better, because in a lot of places you simply don't, I'm afraid.
I think actually did just touch on the freemium thing, which I would normally hate. But I think potentially this season there's a better case for that kind of ultra aggressive structure than there have been in previous seasons, mainly just because we've got that extra wild card. So you could conceivably be a bit more aggressive in those opening kind of 5 or 6 weeks and then resort to something a little less wonky when you've got an idea of kind of the £8 million midfielders, for example, where the value is there, who's kind of performing. So you could see who kind of rises to the top and then revert then. That said, obviously it's me, so I'm never going to touch freemium, but I can see the rationale this season more than I can in previous seasons, I think.
I can understand it as well, but I'm going to leave drafting until probably the last couple of weeks, just because you get down all these sort of mental rabbit holes, you start to mess around with it too much, get fixed ideas, lots of stuff that will come up with the behavioural science pod, which is coming up next week. So much can change. We're not going to go through our own teams where we are, but we'll give some indications of players who are currently parked in our sides during this, just to raise a couple of things before we get into it. The first is tabula rasa, or a clean slate, for those who don't speak ancient Latin. Of course, Latin is ancient. What am I talking about? It's tautology. But anyway, I think that's always the best practice at the start of every season. It's not a case of forgetting what you know, but it's a case of trying to forgive and forget in terms of preconceptions about a player based on last season's results of what he did for you. It's a new year. There'll be new outcomes ahead. So you need to forget if a player wronged you before and try to be objective as much as you can. I mean, Lucy, do you do that?
I really try. I do believe that you should, in general, do that. And I have tried to do that as much as possible. I do think that's an important point. And if you can't do that, I think you need to be honest with yourself. So making a note of those players that have wronged you and going back to them and kind of looking at them in detail. For example, Relish, I know, is one I'll probably talk about. But he underachieved quite significantly statistically, and there's also lots of reasons to think that he might do better this season. So I think reviewing players in detail and being honest about where you might have grudges is probably a good idea.
Yep. Well, provided Grealish has gotten over his epic hangover, I'm assuming that he's, as you said, looking at the stats, one who could do very well at his price point. And the final thing, obviously, we know there are huge ownerships at the moment for certain players. We're not going to reference the ownership numbers throughout this pod. Things will invariably change a lot as we go through pre-season. I don't think basing all of this on those numbers is necessarily worth it. The things like Salah, Haaland, having high ownership should be implicit, as are the rest of the players. There's a few comments that, going with a template is quite easy and you should go with it just in case there's a mass sort of price drop and things like that. We'll probably come on to this, the final pod of pre-season, but maybe, as we said last week, 0.5 million in the bank is the way to go. Hey, it insulates you against that early season transfer market stupidity. So maybe it's the tonic, and maybe this year is the 1 year that I actually bloody do it.
It's not happening, is it? Every single year I go, yeah, that's a really good idea. And I have it in my bank until about 3 days before deadline. And I go, oh, well, look what it would just do there. Yeah, I'll just pop that in.
Cool. All right. Let's give you a quick break there so you can start to break it all up. It might get a little bit long. Hopefully I'll be able to edit it down a little bit further. Then we'll really get into it just after this.
Who got the assist? Who got the assist?
Right, let's get into it then. We're going to mess up the order a bit. We're going to do midfielders, goalkeepers, defenders and strikers, and whistle stop, just as a note, is a bit of an understatement. We're simply not going to be able to cover everyone. And as Lucy said earlier, we're going to look at different price tiers. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to be mentioning ownership too much as it's irrelevant pre-season, but the core 7 are improbably high at the moment. So that 0.5 million in the bank, as we spoke about last week, probably looks like it's a bit of a necessity, but that could change too. Right, midfielders then. There are 215 midfielders in the game at time of recording. And for the premiums, who I'm going to class as 10 million plus, there are 5 of these, so just 2% of midfielders in the game at the time of recording. However, these guys are probably the most important players in our FPL teams year on year because they are the source of the majority of our points, especially when it comes down to captaincy. I guess a really quick opening gambit, Lucy. Would you overthink Salah here?
Well, in a move that will shock everyone, I will be keeping Salah. Don't know if anyone saw that coming. I think there is a case for Son, and I have seen people put together compelling cases. But I think having just what we've just talked about in terms of captaincy being a key issue and ownership being a key issue, and that Salah loves an opening day haul, I think gambling against him could be hugely damaging if you misjudge it. So I think going by the old saying that you can't win FPL in game week 1, but you can lose it, I think Salah's the one that I cover off almost without thinking. So, yeah, I don't know if you feel the same on that one.
I do. 87 million is my budget. That's kind of how I looked at it at the start of the season. I think any other player, I could probably be persuaded that I can't overthink Salah on this one. He's simply Mr. FPL in a lot of ways. And that enduring brilliance, I think, has become so expected that it's implicit. I'm not going to talk about Salah too much here, but 200 club finishes in all seasons, right up there in expected data year after year. And betting against him, as you say, especially yet with that kind of game week 1 against a newly promoted team, again, it feels like folly to me. Like, he's a sacrosanct FPL asset, despite the back end of last year being a time to go without him, of course. I know that, for example, KDB got a lot of interest last year to just move on to another premium. So I think we're probably going to establish Salah's in. And last year, 196 points for KDB after a quiet 2021. I kind of feel like, and we'll talk about Haaland later, but him being 12 at the moment has completely priced him out of the discussion, hasn't it? Because Haaland's 11.5.
I think so. Yeah, I didn't even consider KDB as much as I like him as a player. You know, he's been a very consistent asset in the game. I just think what you're getting from Haaland is probably one of the best strikers in the world at a lower rate than I expected. And I think given that we've seen them potentially kind of hold out for Haaland, I think there was a situation last season where we asked, did City need a central striker? Why didn't they have a central striker? I think that suggests that he's going to be pretty pivotal to them. There's obviously been a lot of kind of promotion around him being the new number 9 and all of that kind of thing. So I can't see him being anything other than a key player. And if you're a central striker in a team that creates as many chances as City does, I just can't see it being a loser. I hate to go on about EO, and I didn't actually want to discuss it in any way. But given that Haaland's been such a popular pick since the game launched, I don't think there's much risk with it either. So, yes, I think Haaland's the obvious choice on that one, as much as I'd like KDB to be an option.
Fair enough. I mean, the other 12 million before we get into the 10s is Son. And I feel like it's a bit of a harsh overlook, isn't it? I mean, we spoke about the freemium a little bit, and I think we'll come back to kind of team structure and the final pod of pre-season. But I can see why people are looking at that a little bit. You do leave yourself very thin structurally, so you're going to be doing something like fielding a couple of 4.5 defenders that you really need to place trust in. But I think there's obviously long-term value with Son. I know a lot of people are defaulting to Perisic, who we'll cover later as their Spurs cover. But there's that enticing openings, a kind of Saints game in the moment.
I think Son's the reason that freemium seems justifiable, but I won't be going for it. There's more than enough reason to look at him. But I just think, from my perspective, structurally, it just throws it too far out. So I can't justify him, and I wouldn't put him ahead of Salah. And I like the balance that's created by having a premium striker and a premium midfielder. So the obvious thing is that if you don't go for Son, you could potentially look at kind of the slightly next tier down. So there's Bruno Fernandes and there's Raheem Sterling. Now, I think those are probably two assets that you can't really justify, throwing your whole structure out for from the beginning, but I think they're definitely two worth keeping tabs on. Obviously, with Sterling, you've got the prospective moves to Chelsea, which looks like it'll be finalised. And with Bruno Fernandes, you've got the kind of impact of Ten Hag. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, Tom, but given that Sterling's got quite a rich history in FPL, and even when he had bad seasons, he still managed 19 and 20 goal involvements. He's not doing too bad for himself. And of course, in the 3 seasons prior to that, he hit the 200 club.
I think he'll be really good, actually. I'm really excited by his prospects at Chelsea. I think he will benefit from being the main man, that's for sure. As you said, you're talking about a player who's got 3 200 clubs as his team's main attacking weapon. Very explosive, which I'm a fan of too. And at 10, he could be a real sleeper pick as the potential Son of this year. I think he's a candidate, again, to break the 200 club, I'd say, given past performance. I don't think he's going to be a member of the Tuchel Tombola, as it's called. I think that he'll be kind of Tuchel's Salah. He will pretty much play as many games as he's able to. So redirect player who could be awesome at Chelsea. On Bruno, I think that a lot of that is contingent on what happens with Ronaldo. I think we saw Bruno be a little bit muted last year, I think, with his fellow Portuguese around. I think they're very much kind of a keep an eye on kind of situation with them. I do like the idea of Sterling, potentially kind of building a freemium with Sterling at some point. But in future, I think that they're basically just a good alternative to a Haaland, or if something happens to Mo Salah, freeing up that 1.5 million or 2.5 million, whatever it's going to be, to play with later down the line. If something happens where a one premium setup looks favourable, could be really, really good. So probably wouldn't go on to begin with either of those two. But given the all-round potential of those players, they could be worth looking at. But 1.5 to 2 million less, there's a cluster of players who provide probably the most interesting price point in FPL at the moment, which are the 8 million, or 8.5 including Bowen midfielders. So there are, all the way from 8.5 all the way down to, I don't know, let's say kind of 6. So about 10% of midfielders in FPL in this bracket. But sticking with the 8s to 8.5s at the moment, I think having one of these is pretty essential for your team structure, isn't it, at the moment? And given the nature of those players as well, they seem like the sort of players who were last year's talisman within this bracket. Their proven FPL performance probably won all of them. Bowen, Maddison, Saka and Mount, value to be found in this bracket. So I mentioned 4 there. There's also a few more at this price: Foden, Mahrez, Kolasevsky, and Luis Diaz. All options very high ceilings. But I guess preference to start the season, Lucy, is the best question here. We don't need to sell you on these guys as much in terms of who they are. So it's more kind of, I guess, more kind of tactical who you go with at the moment, I think, or whether you can go 2 of them. What are you thinking at the moment here?
Well, to kind of recap on the structure situation, I think that one of them is more or less essential if you're not going for that freemium option. There's even a decent argument to go for 2. As to who I favour, at the moment, I have Luis Diaz. I know Robertson's also got a good claim to that 3rd spot, and there's a bit of a kind of tension there in the sense that Andy Robertson's output increased when Diaz was introduced. So Diaz's kind of expected minutes both improve him and Andy Robertson. So there's a kind of double-edged sword going on a bit there. But I think Diaz makes a lot of sense from the perspective that you'd have been quite happy paying, I don't know, 10 million for Sadio Mane. And Diaz is probably playing in the same position he was playing. Admittedly, not with the same certainty about minutes and appearances, especially with Nunez and Jota around. But I think given what he potentially offers, he's quite a tempting option. The other one that I've kind of come quite close to putting in is Saka. But at the moment, I've kind of swung towards Diaz. I don't know who you've got in there at the moment, Tom.
Well, I do like Diaz, actually. I think it's 0.59 XGI per 90 last season. That's really attractive, to be honest. And he is the go-to for the no Salah mob, that's for sure. Given the price and given the fact that he may sew up Mane's spot for 8 million, as you said, you'd be happy to pay 10 million for Mane, 11 million for Mane. It's just that Diaz is a little bit unproven, but in terms of the points per 90, that's very good and worth looking at. And Liverpool's starting fixtures are definitely desirable in terms of attacking fixtures. They're up there with Man City, shock horror. So I can see why he's in, that's for sure. And Saka also, similar XGI to a lot of the boys in the upper echelons, clear talisman for Arsenal last year. The problem is that he's impacted in the same way De Bruyne was by having a like asset priced around the same as Gabriel Jesus. Fixtures are very good for Saka. He does have the lowest points per 90 based on last season, though, for Saka. And the question is Jesus probably a better option? I think he probably is at this point. So
Who do you think gets penalties?
I think that Saka keeps them. Listen to City fans. He's not the best at penalties, if that makes sense. He's not known for taking penalties. So I suspect that Saka does keep them. That's probably not the be all and end all, really.
It's not.
As a swinger to Saka. It's just another kind of
recipe, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a pro for him. I do think one player does deserve a bit of mention here. That's Kolasevsky. I really liked how we ended last season. 7 points per 90 at the back end of last season is not to be stiffed at. 0.5 XGI per 90 as well is not too shabby. He's actually in my draft at the moment, Lucy. And the reason for that is that he provides a solution to a bit of a problem that I've got. So apart from Perisic, Spurs, as I said earlier with Son, are a bit of a blind spot going into game week 1, I think. And we've reflected how Son and later, probably Kane are crowded out by Salah and Haaland. Now, Kolasevsky is 8 million, has already shown his quality, and crucially, through Richarlison being banned for game week 1, will definitely play the Southampton game. I don't think he'll necessarily be jettisoned for game week 2 either. I don't know how it will work with Richarlison, who he is kind of coming in to sort of replace or be the alternate to, because Conte has said that he plays across the front three. And I think for me, Kulu's in a good spot because as an early season front, he occupies an important price point. I know we don't normally like temporary pickups, but we have a bit of a strange season where we've got 3 wild cards and adding to his price being quite decent and being kind of a price which enables you to move between players at that price point. I feel like that's okay. I really do.
And I think people are slightly overstating the threat of Richarlison to him. I think Conte said that he sees him as playing across the front three. And I just don't see him as being bought exclusively as Kulusevski's competition, which is kind of somehow how some people have framed it, which I don't think really kind of cuts it, especially when you factor into the fact that Richarlison's not really got any history of playing off the right. He's classically played through the middle or off the left. So obviously he could play left and then maybe Son switch out right. But I don't think he's quite as much of an alternative to Kulusevski as some people have suggested.
Yeah, and the creativity as well is that Kulusevski represents simply isn't replicated by Richarlison. So I think there is definitely something in that with Kulusevski. Obviously, you kind of would like to go with the alpha and omega, but sometimes you do have to go for the theta, and it could be that that's Kolasevsky. I do like him at that price point.
Diaz and Kolasevsky are doing quite a similar thing in terms of giving you an additional route into a good attack.
That's it. Kulu does offer that sort of solution to a problem if you aren't convinced by Perisic, and I'm iffy on that one at the moment. Other ones to mention, Maddison ended the season very strongly, big explosions in the doubles, and Leicester don't have to worry about Europe now, which is a clear plug for him. He actually outscored Saka last season, and a healthy points per 90 of 6.61, actually. Maybe a bit under the radar in terms of how teams are set up. And there is a difficult Arsenal game for Leicester at the start of the season, but that sort of masks the fact that there's two really nice home fixtures, game week 1 against Brentford, the game week 3 against Southampton for Leicester. Very explosive as well, Maddison. 38 points in the last 2 game weeks of last season, especially double game week 37 where he really went off. So, I mean, he could be one that's kind of a bit of a dark horse right now, as is Mount, I think, who's been slightly hard done by. FPL Review, who I would strongly recommend you go and check out, has brought out his ratings recently, and he's actually top for 8.0 million midfielders. Got double figures for goals and assists last season, which is kind of a bit under the radar for him. And it'd be really interesting to see how he and Sterling interplay together. Have you seen how hench he is as well, by the way, now?
I think Maddison, I think you kind of nailed it when you talked about the kind of absence of Europa League. I think that had a significant impact on Leicester as a general group last season. I think that's, apart from the Vardy injury, has been a kind of big reason why we didn't really look at them until we came to double game weeks. I think with the lack of that kind of commitment, that should have quite a positive impact for all of their attackers, but especially Maddison. Mount, yes, I did see that he's looking hench. I think there's quite a lot of studies to suggest that that's not necessarily beneficial, but we'll carry on. I think he's probably one of those players that I always underestimate to a certain extent. There's something about him that just never really kind of attracts me to him, so that's why probably I haven't really considered him. Obviously the other ones at this price point to mention are Foden and Mahrez seems to be getting kind of a lot of attention on Twitter at the moment, basically because people seem to think that he's going to play all the minutes in the world all of a sudden, which I'm not sure I can get on board with. I think there's still plenty in that squad that could play off that right wing. Bernardo Silva's got a history of doing it. Foden, obviously, with his left foot, is actually probably quite suited to that. And then, of course, Alvarez, who's just joined from Argentina, he's also played there. So I don't think it's quite as clear-cut as people are kind of suggesting with Mahrez, although I did see today that he's about to sign a new contract, so maybe I know nothing, and that Mahrez is suddenly a much more reliable option. And, of course, you've also got Foden. I don't know how you feel about those City players, though, Tom, because they're always a bit of a rotation risk, aren't they?
I'll probably have Cancelo, I think, almost definitely having Haaland. So I think it's probably a case that I probably don't want to over tilt too much onto City, especially, as you say, because of that risk. It's an implicit risk, but one we probably need to mention. With Mahrez particularly, I don't buy this idea that he's suddenly nailed because Jesus and Sterling have gone. I know I spoke about Tabula Rasa earlier on, but I'm still a bit sceptical of him. It's really hard to kind of ever trust with Mahrez that he's going to play 2 games consecutively. And with Haaland also new to the press, I don't know if Mahrez, who's probably the weakest in terms of the press, is going to be paired with him very often. I think Luke Disable via Planet FPL has theorised that as well. I'm sure I've taken that from there. I think that every time on Mahrez and FPL Twitter consensus has gained weight, that Mahrez will quote unquote definitely play the next game. He simply hasn't. And I think for me, he's the epitome of the pitfalls of predicting Pep. So I'm not too sure on him. I do like Foden. I think that he could be a player who is overlooked pre-season because you've got Haaland, you've probably got one defender and you're thinking, oh, I don't want to triple up. But historically, he's on an upward trajectory. And this year could be the year, especially with the lack of opposition to him, I guess, that could really kind of make him into a player that would make a mockery of the 8.0 price tag. But I suppose there's another City player, isn't there, Lucy, in debonair Jack Grealish, who perhaps at 7 million could be interesting too.
I really struggled to make a case for Jack Grealish. I think I mentioned it earlier on in the sense that he did to a certain extent underperform. So he was actually looking at 0.53 XGI per 90, which is actually pretty decent, but we just never really saw the output for it. I find the 7 million category in general quite problematic from a kind of structural perspective. There's just not enough there to make me think that I want to kind of carve that out in my squad. I just don't think it leaves you with enough flexibility. I think it's one of those categories where, I'm sure we'll kind of talk about them, so there's Barnes as well, it's another example, and Coutinho. I think those are all the ones that you can kind of keep tabs on and not feel like you need to commit to them, because you can kind of pull up to them from the 5.5 category and come down to them from the 8 million category. I think there's just so much value in that 8 million category that it's very difficult to make a case for any of those 7 millions. I don't know if you feel warmer on any of those ones.
Not really. I mean, Harvey Barnes at 7 struck me as good value when I saw the price point. I mean, he, to the eye, is a player who's very much a 2 in 10 sort of player. But 8 times out of 10, he's a headless chicken, runs on a blind alley and gives the ball away. 2 out of 10, cuts inside and finishes with aplomb. Really decent per 90 score, but points per 90 score last season of 5.86. So of 7 millions, that's second to Gundogan, or 7.5 million, so second to Gundogan. But yeah, with him, with Coutinho, and Coutinho's got potential, as we know, very kind couple of open fixtures with Villa, and Zaha as well at Palace, who finished up their talisman, lots of shots in the box, lots of big chances last year playing as a forward. They could all represent decent value. It's just, as you say, structurally, if it was better to go with an 8, maybe even 2 8s, and maybe leave this category as one to drop down to, because you're probably not going to lose anything by missing these guys. Is it the same for the 6.5s? Trossard, JWP, anyone in here?
I think for JWP, this is discussed every single season. People go, look what he got last season. Look, why didn't we have him? And the problem is that the guy's dependent on set pieces pretty much. So, you know, corners headed in or free kicks, and your odds of predicting when those are going to take place are pretty slim. So every single year, I think we pretty much say, oh yeah, should have had him. But no one manages their team with a 6.5 all season keeper, you know, keep him there and not do anything with him. So it's almost kind of a pointless conversation on JWP.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think he's scored 10. He scored the most goals he's ever scored in the Premier League last year. He got into double figures. He got 10, but 8 were from set pieces, 4 free kicks, 4 penalties. A free kick's basically a penalty for him, isn't it? Let's be fair. But yeah, no, you're right. It's just unpredictable, and no one likes that unless you're playing a zombie team or you're playing, you know, a game where you've got limited transfers. Maybe.
Oh yes, for a zombie team, he'd be a great choice.
Yeah, but exactly. Straight in
the real world. No.
I mean,
but there is one person in that 6.5 category, isn't there, Tom?
There is. I mean, it's Trossard, isn't it? No, dear me. No, sorry, I have talked up Trossard. I'm going to have to kind of come clean now. I've talked up Trossard and talisman theory. There's lots of stats and meaning for that. He's got an uncanny similarity, actually, in terms of last season's data and Bowen's 2 years ago. So if Brighton put it all together, I think that Trossard could definitely be one to watch, but not for the start of the season. One at the start of the season I really like, Marx Rashford. I mentioned him earlier on. 3 million price drop. The biggest one we saw of any player this season, as Nick reported online, just this week gone. And why I'm interested in Rashford is threefold. One, Rashford is hardly an unknown quantity. He had a really shoddy season last year. That's undisputed. But this is a player with 2 175-point finishes under his belt and could, along with Sancho, 7.5, another one didn't mention there, really be resurrected an asset this season. Obviously, we don't know yet if he's a starter. But if he's not looking like he's going to be a starter, judging by preseason, it's easy to remove as well. But if he is, this is the guy who has overperformed well in his numbers last couple of seasons before the one before, and which means that with a fair wind, he can make a mockery of that price tag and provide decent value, especially if Ten Hag is the man to bring United back to where the fans believe they belong. The second reason, the midfield 2 to 4 feels a good punt slot. As I said, there's an 8 million player in there, that's for sure. But 3 and 4, definitely there's a spot for one punt at least. It's wide open at the moment. And we'll talk about kind of the 6s and the 5.5s in a minute. But at the moment, Rashford at 6.5 is a great risk to take early doors, provided he's looking like he's going to start. Not owning a Salah or a Haaland may well punish you, but not owning a player at this price point probably won't. And that leads me to the final point, bandwagon ability. If Rashford does well early, his price will skyrocket given the low base and how easy it is to reach. It's always easier to own from the start a player like that than buy in. I mean, clearly it's contingent on pre-season, other factors aligning, but I really think we need to observe what we always say and try to employ tabula rasa when it comes to a new season with a player like Rashford, whose confidence was clearly shot after the unpleasantness after the World Cup. And I think there's always room for redemption in FPL, especially with a player who's still quite young. Though I don't know if a cautious manager would agree. Would they, Lucy?
I am actually incredibly tempted by Rashford. I think there are lots of reasons, and you've touched on most of them. I think there was one thing I wanted to say was that I don't think he's had a proper pre-season in a very long time. And kind of aside from the confidence issue, which he clearly had last season, is that he's never really had like a kind of good run of fitness and a kind of consistency to the health and fitness of his game. That's not been the case for 2 or 3 years. And I think you've seen that in his football. So I think that could also have another important impact. I think also the other thing when we're talking about bandwagon ability is that he's a Manchester United player. We consistently see the masses go wild for a Man United player, often actually completely unjustified. But in this case, if you were to see Rashford pick up a few early goals, or, even just one goal, would be enough probably to get all those Man United fans really excited about him. And thus you could see exactly what you're saying in terms of his ownership rocketing. So actually, considering how conservative I normally am, I'm surprised by how tempted I am.
Very, very decent, I think. All of the ingredients are there. We just need a spark to light the fire, don't we? Getting down to the fringes, so midfielders who are 6 million and below, there are 188 of these players. There's more midfielders than any other classification in FPL. 88% of all midfielders are priced at 6 million and below, which just shows you what a wide pool this is to fish in. I'm not going to talk about it too much, obviously, or go for every player. 6 million and below. Let's stick to 6 before we get into that very, very testy 5.5 slot. At 6, there's obviously Martinelli, potentially Bruno G, and then Ben Rama, etc., etc. Can he repeat the train at 6? Bruno G, huge points per 90 last season, 5.74. Most of his data wasn't too much to write home about, but certainly looking like the footballing talisman, if not the FPL talisman of the Toon Army. Very, very good on Foot Manager, not that matters. And he's got a decent pair of opening fixtures, actually, with Forest and Brighton, before they run to a few trickier ones after that. But decent points per 90 there. I'm looking at Martinelli and thinking, oh, well, last year, he and Smith Rowe seemed to be sharing minutes depending on the opposition. Could Bruno G be the guy in the 6 million slot, or are we just ignoring this one as well, Lucy?
I'm more on the 6 million slot than I'm on the 7 million slot. I think, talking about Bruno G, I think that was one of those ones where actually, if you'd done a bit of research on Bruno last season, you were pretty much punished for it because he typically took a much deeper role and a less kind of involved role for Lyon than he did from Newcastle, and he actually played a little bit more advanced, and that created a lot more kind of goal involvement. So he was up to 0.41 for Newcastle last season, up from his very best at Lyon was 0.25. So we're not talking about amazing figures here, but that's quite a significant percentage increase in terms of involvement. And he wasn't playing primarily as that holding role. He was playing as an 8 and making kind of late runs and doing a bit more. So I think for people like probably you and me who had looked into his role and thought, no, he's not really much value, he was a bit of a surprise. And I don't want to kind of sleep on him too hard this season. So actually, I have kind of looked at him. Obviously, you're the Arsenal fan. So to come back to Martinelli, I kind of got the feeling looking through his minutes that once he kind of convinced Arteta of his merits, his minutes weren't that bad. Like he, occasionally got benched, but I thought they were pretty good, actually.
But I still think he's the one who comes out, though, if Smith Rowe has a spurt of quote-unquote form. I can't see Saka being moved out, for example. I don't really think that ESR is slated to play the 10 role that Odegaard's probably would be occupying. See how it goes with Fabio Vieira as well. I just wonder with Martinelli, I know that pound for pound, he offers great on paper value for money. It's just whether you want that sort of initial risk in your team at the start of the season. I do think he starts the season for what it's worth. I noticed earlier on that Saka probably is on penalties. If Martinelli's on the pitch, he's on penalties, which again is a bit of a plus for a 6 million. So I completely understand why you'd be looking that way. And if you look at our fixtures, especially if you're saying I'm going to be wildcarding fairly early, it's a game week sort of 6 or 7, 8, something like that. then having him in for a short period of time does actually appeal. So I'm not writing him off entirely, that's for sure. I do think he's interesting.
Good. That's what I like to hear.
Cool. Well, I mean, let's move down one more to the 5.5s. I know there's definitely a lot of discussion about these guys because they're structurally probably pretty interesting if you're looking for that sort of 4-4-2 straightforward template thing we've spoken about. I want to mention quickly is Fornals here, and he's one who's really flown under the radar. Like me and my friend Libero were having a chat, and he was one that came up in conversation just because he's a starter for West Ham. Fornals last season he got 32 starts, 4 off the bench as well, and he got 3.76 points per 90, which hardly sets the world alight, but that isn't bad at all at his price. And he was also just outside the top 30 in all players in the Premier League last season in terms of non-penalty expected goals and assists as well, at 10.6. That's the same level as the likes of Conor Gallagher, Richarlison and João Cancelo. That's not bad for a 5.5. I know they've got the opening game against Man City. We didn't speak about Bowen at all. And I think that is probably symptomatic of the fact that there's the opening games, other players with more sort of attractive opening games. But at 5.5, I don't really see much drawback to Fornals, apart from that opening fixture. I mean, he's a starter for West Ham on paper. And if you watch them play, he's integral to their attack. So that's not bad at all, really, if you're looking for a West Ham player. Just to reel off the rest of the players here, you've got Mr. Visser, my current team named after him. Wissa made a mistake, or was like a Jar Jar Binks reference. He had the best points per 90 last year amongst players at the 5.5 category, 6.5. A lot of that is due to him scoring 25 points in the final 3 game weeks. And he took an 0.5 million reduction this year as well. So one to keep an eye on if he gets that front berth in pre-season. Like Felice, Eze, Pedence, Gray, but there's one big one here, isn't there, Lucy, which seems to be in everybody's team now, and that is Pedro Netto.
Yes, Pedro Netto seems to be, I want to say, inexplicably popular. What I mean by that is that I don't think it's unjustified to look at him, but the kind of scale of enthusiasm for him is just a bit over the top. And I say that for a few reasons. One being that I'm not sure we've got sufficient sample size to kind of make any judgments of last season. So he only played the minutes equivalent of about 5 games when he came back from injury. You could extrapolate back a bit further. They're fairly solid numbers. I think he's looking at typically around 0.4 MP XGI per 90, which would probably put him level with a few kind of a little bit higher up than him. That's, similar to Odegaard's XGI. But can you really use those numbers from 2 seasons ago to extrapolate when this Wolves attack has been quite significantly dented over the last 18 months or so? So you've got the Jimenez injury. He's never really quite looked the same since that injury. Fabio Silva hasn't really looked capable of kind of filling his boots either. They've kind of lacked real kind of thrust, and there's no real consistency of Podence either. So I'm just a bit cold on Wolves as an attacking structure, which therefore turns me off Pedro Netto to a certain extent. I quite like them to make proper use of Morgan Gibbs White, but it looks like they're kind of touting him for sales. So that does make me uneasy on Netto. I guess the thing is his ownership will likely be high, so you can't really lose. But I do think it's worth looking elsewhere. We mentioned Visser very briefly there. They look like they've just signed Keane Lewis Potter from Hull, and he often plays off the left, which is where he was playing a lot. So I think there's going to be a kind of doubt about him there. I could be sold on Fornals for sure. I feel like at this point, I can relatively reasonably mention Saints players. I don't think any of them are worthy from the start, but I thought I'd just shoehorn them in there anyway. Our fixtures are terrible, so please don't buy any of them. And I repeat, don't buy any of them. But if you are kind of looking a bit further along, maybe one of the wildcards, Stuart Armstrong is potentially really good value. He's 5 million, playing predominantly as a 10 in our system, which is pretty much a wide player, but we call them 10s. And Joe Aribo just arrived from Rangers at 5.5. He's got a decent kind of record for goal involvement, and he could be another option off those wings. So just one to flag there. But yeah, I think just being careful about Netto and not just putting him by default. The problem we have is that the way that most of our teams are structured is that we do need one of these players. So you're just going to have to take a punt and know that 5.5 isn't a lot to gamble, I think. I
agree. It's the same with the 5s as well. Like Stu Armstrong, Leon Bailey, Football Manager legend, did a goal the other day. So suddenly he's essential as well. I think at the 5 millions, it's very much one of those things where it's like, there's not much to say. I think we should leave it at that. 4.5 to finish off the midfielders. Are we all buying Andreas Pereira, Lucy?
I think so. I think as always, you want people in the segment that are going to get you 60 minutes just so that you can get your 2 points any goal threat being a bonus. I think any goal threat was always a bonus, but it really is a bonus now, given that they've trimmed back the category. And the problem is, I think by trimming back the category, they were trying to make the game more challenging. That's my only theory there. So you've got people like Oriol Romeu, who is a blatant yellow card magnet, coming at 5 million. Don't know how you justify that one. But it all it means is that we all just gravitate around the one player. So if we find a player that's going to start, everyone has him. So you've kind of just killed it as a kind of point of variance and differentiation, because everyone's just going to have the same player. So I just want to have that rant that I don't think that move to skim out the 4.5 was a good idea.
Can I just point out that Romeu doubled his attacking returns last year? He went from 1 goal and 1 assist to 2 goals and 2 assists. Therefore, he is worth 0.5 more. But yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I think it's one of those things where ownership at this level does matter. I think in terms of players who are going to provide 2 points plus any sort of potential, you've got probably Andres Pereira, who's by all intents and purposes going to be playing an attacking role for Fulham. Josh Da Silva at Brentford looks to be one who's gathering pace a bit. FPL dummy Tom, who's Planet FPL's Brentford correspondent, was singing his praises. Sounds like he got unlucky last season, a little bit of those injuries, and that absurdly long suspension at one point. I think he got suspended in 1 month and could only come back 2 months later due to a quirk of the calendar. But he could be the Eriksen replacement, it sounds like, which isn't bad at 4.5 and kind of an ostensibly attacking team. But I think what's key is that ownership point that you mentioned there, Lucy. Owning the highest owned 4.5, and this also makes sense for 4.0s in terms of defenders and probably the 4.5 forwards, is probably the way to go, because it insulates you against price falls. At least that is the received wisdom. So more people owning tends to mean that a higher proportion need to sell to enact a price change judged by what we know. It's best to go with that higher owned player in each of these brackets to ward off losing cash, not mad cash. When we saw the bracket firsthand, it looked like a cacophony of trash. But the news was announced on Pereira moving and Josh Da Silva and so on and so forth. It's just better to go with the crowd, really, overall. You pay 0 for this guy, really, because you've got to pay 4.5 for a midfielder. So either of those players look absolutely fine to me, as long as they look like they're going to star. You've also got, likes of Alzate and Sarmiento at Brighton, but there we go. It really is kind of quite a fallow category, isn't it? But it's really interesting that we seem to have gone from a shaky 12-man squad to a 14-man squad now, which is quite cool to see.
Yeah, it gives you a bit more confidence, I think. And it should mean that you can look at players that are a little bit more risky. I do think that expected minutes are important, but I think you can maybe take a couple of more kind of slightly gambly picks than you could otherwise, knowing that if the worst came to the worst, you'd at least get a couple of points off the bench. Does that mean that we've now finished midfielders? Is that a category down?
It does. We should just do the goalkeepers before we take a quick break. I mean, it's definitely an interesting one. There's 50 goalkeepers in the game this season, and picking a goalkeeper back in the day was like, right, Nick Pope, Tom Heaton, you'll do, get in my team, and you aren't leaving for 38 game weeks. I miss those days, especially me having made 7 goalkeeper transfers last season. Is it worth? I know. Is it worth, Lucy, paying more than 4.5 million for your goalkeeper?
I am a proponent of 4.5 keepers, and I think they've actually been strengthened this season by the fact that we've got a few more than we sometimes do. So that kind of gives you a bit of flexibility if you want to change. But I think more than that, we've got the effective extra wild card as a result of the World Cup. And I think that means that you can probably be quite tactical in the way that you kind of target blocks for those 4.5s. So we talk about the kind of received wisdom being that you don't use free transfers on goalkeepers, or you try to limit that. Just so you know, Tom, you try and limit it. But if you want to kind of make those changes, you've got a bit more flexibility this season to do that. So I'm warmer on the 4.5s than I have been on previous seasons, and I don't need a lot of convincing on them in general. I mean, I think, Tom, one of the big ways that people were kind of moving away from the 4.5s was for Mendy. I think there was a lot of hype when the prices came out that Mendy would be a value option. I'm a bit sceptical. What do you think on that one?
Chelsea lost their oomph at the end of last season, that's for sure. Their defenders became completely untenable because they just basically went, well, you know what, Premier League's done. We've got third, so let's concentrate on the cups. But it's worth mentioning last season, they kept the second most clean sheets they had in the last 4 years. So it's not like they were completely useless. That's for sure. And the saves actually weren't too far off either, what you'd expect the likes of Alisson and Ederson to do. The problem is that there's uncertainty with that Chelsea defence even now. They still need to sign a couple of centre-backs. I think they're kind of, apart from Chalobah and the likes of that, their only remaining senior centre-back is 38-year-old, I think, Thiago Silva. So the calibre of player they're going to be signing is very high. It's just the limited time that Tuchel's going to have to ingratiate them into his system. So Mendy, I can see why people are looking at him, that's for sure. A bit higher, I can see why people are looking at Ederson as well. You can get 150 to 180 points at 5.5, which could be really worthwhile. Again, no one manages a zombie team in real season, but 4.19, I think it was, points per 90 last season was pretty decent. Alisson's actually superior at 4.89 points per 90 because he's got loads of saves as well. Lots of seriously good saves, Alisson, actually. But again, he limits what you can get in, especially if there comes a point when you can have a triple Liverpool or a triple Man City in the outfield. In the 4.5s, the best, I mean, what I did to assess this, I was really lazy. I put this on Twitter as well afterwards and got an inevitable barracking from a few people. But I looked at two key stats for goalkeepers who had played 20 more games last season, points per 90 and saves per 90, and add them together to make a really lazy goalkeeper index. I know some saves are double counted. I know that. But this is a really lazy shorthand to get a feel of who comes out on top amongst those important metrics. Sarr come out on top, followed by Raya, then Schmeichel, then Alisson, and so on. Basically, if you want a 5, Sarr's good. We knew that last season when we nominated this goalkeeper of the season in the last pod last season. But I think Raya's mix of points per 90 and saves per 90 make him a worthwhile pickup, especially given Brentford's start of the season. The only fly in the ointment is Strakosha, who has signed for them too, it seems, from Lazio. I mean, Strakosha was my goalkeeper on my most recent Lazio save. He's very good. He also is a sweeper keeper. But in the same way, it looks like that's kind of a twofold sort of thing. One, the lad, I think it was Fernandez last year, hasn't been kept on. He was there on loan, but hasn't been kept on. So they need a proper backup goalkeeper. The second backup is Balcoom or Cox. I think the two of them are, and they're both young and untested. And the other thing is Raya only has 2 years left in his contract. So I think they're kind of future-proofing / making sure they're not in trouble if Raya gets injured again. So I think that Raya is going to be the number one. I think that he'd be the number one I'm looking at the moment. I've got really bad memories of the likes of Sanchez, the likes of Guaitar. So Raya at the moment hasn't left my team. He was the one that I was really kind of nerdily pleased was 4.5. I think his mix of points per 90 and saves per 90 make him the most worthwhile pickup here. Hopefully that's the way you've gone as well.
Yes, that is the way I'm currently sat. I didn't actually have Sanchez as much as some people last season, so I'm not quite so scarred by him. So I think he's a decent alternative if you find later down the season that you think his fixtures look better, or for whatever reason Raya isn't what we thought he would be. So I think you've got kind of points to pivot off, which again makes Raya attractive. But yeah, Raya's the pick I've got in. I don't like the idea of super premium picks on this for the Alissons and Edersons, just because of that point you just made in terms of it taking up slots that you might need for something else. I could be convinced on Lloris, actually. Spurs kept the most clean sheets after those top 2. I thought Spurs might look at recruitment for a potential successor, given that Lloris isn't the springest of chickens. That's not a thing, but you know what I mean.
The springiest of chickens.
Isn't a spring chicken. But they haven't really done that, so it looks like he's fine, and potentially there could be value there if kind of Conte has a effect on their defence, which seemed to be the case last season. So if I was going to go down the premium route, it would be Lloris, but I think Raya is a really kind of sensible pick at this point.
Cool. No, the only other thing to mention here is that if you are favouring early wildcards, like really early wildcards, you might look at Ramsdale potentially and spend that extra 0.5, really good opening fixtures. If you don't like any of the Arsenal 4.5s or 5.0s, or you're going for that 5 at the back and really going for it with the defence, Ramsdale could be quite a good. Sarr could be good actually, because their fixtures are quite good. All caveats about Wolves' side, but yes, interesting category. I think 4.5s, Raya is absolutely fine. Cool. 2 categories down, 2 to go. Let's take a break there, and we'll be back with you in just a moment.
Who got the assist? Who got the assist?
So we're back, and it's time to talk about the defenders. There are 182 of these in the game at the moment, and for premium, so ones I'm going to put at 5.5 and above, there are only 13 of these, so 7% of all defenders at the moment. And the big question, Lucy, is can we look past Trent and Cancelo?
I can't look past Trent. I could be convinced on maybe overlooking Cancelo. Trent, I think his numbers speak for himself. Everyone who plays FPL semi-seriously is probably quite aware of those. Cancelo, I think, significantly underachieved from a kind of XG perspective. So you could have arguably got more points out of him. I think he underperformed by 3 or 4 on his XG. So that's quite significant and probably would have shifted opinion on him. I could be convinced that if I wanted money elsewhere, that Laporte might be okay. So I can look elsewhere on Cancelo, but I probably won't, if I'm completely honest, because it's me.
Yeah, I agree with everybody who looked at Trent's price and just thought, with the greatest respect, that's a bit of a cowardly pricing. Like, I think that 8.5, that would have given people a real question. 7.5 for Trent, best non-pen XG and XA for defenders, bar none. The guy's like 22, 23. Like, it's just absolutely ridiculous. Like, I just find it quite difficult to think of. Cancelo, yep, you're right. Fun fact, he had 83 shots last year. That's 30 more than Trent in seconds. 23 shots on target, that 83. 8 more than Trent. Decent XG. Loads of people remember him flashing in lots of speculative long shots last season, and obviously the XG is kind of underpinned by the fact some of them were on target. My memory is of him missing lots of chances in the box, actually, lots of like one-on-ones, whatever. I still think he's a lock where I'm concerned at the moment, just because of the extra dimension he has to City. It'll be interesting to see if Cucurella goes there and how it kind of all eventually kind of turns out. But I think that those two, for me at the moment, haven't really gone anywhere. I do know what you're saying about Laporte. I know Sam, FPL Sports Science, mentioned Laporte's very good numbers. And City's defence can be like printing points, really, if you own 2 of them. There's really an overall point to be made in the favour of centre-backs like Laporte, Van Dijk, your man Matip, Diaz, with that deepening of the 5 subs rule we spoke about last week, and that potential for value to be found in centre-backs, as is always miraculously discovered at the end of the season. Like, everyone's like, oh, these centre-backs, they seem to play quite a lot. But in a campaign where X-Mins are more important than ever before, it could be that the centre-backs like Van Dijk, like Laporte, like Diaz become very important. But the only one who would probably maybe convince me off Trent is obviously his teammate Robertson. So he had very good exit velocity last season. Trent scored 174 points in the first 28 game weeks, which is 83% of his total output. He only scored 34 points in the final 10. So he, along with Salah, was basically disposable at the back end of last year in hindsight. In contrast, Robertson scored 62 points over that final 10 game week period. I wonder why this was. I wondered if it was the introduction of Luis Diaz. And the beauty of FPL Twitter is that someone's already done the work for you a lot of the time. And my friend Praz FPL had done it for me here, which is very handy, so it stopped me having to look it up. But in 16 games, Robbo, Trent and Diaz played together in all competitions. Diaz, 3 goals, 3 assists. Robertson, 2 goals, 5 assists. Trent, 3 assists. So a very, very small sample size, but something to keep tabs on in terms of the balance of how Liverpool's attack could look as we filter through the campaign. So maybe Robertson at 7 might be more of a question than we've realised in terms of Trent if he needs to take that 0.5 for some reason. I don't even know. And the other guys, well, we'll talk about Perisic and Co in a second, but at 6 are the Chelsea win-backs, Lucy. I mean, Chilwell, James. I mean, James is currently in the template based off his almost stats-defying one or haul or not playing at all, sort of weird triumvirate last year. I mean, is he in your team at the moment, or is he one that you've considered?
Yes, he is in my team at the moment. You could also make a very good argument for Chilwell. I won't kind of go over old territory too much on this one, just to kind of briefly mention what we spoke about last week and we spoke about is that we're going to see a lot of changes from Chelsea on the defensive side. They need centre-backs and that will happen. And we've also seen the potential that Tuchel might look at formation change, which would push them potentially back into a back 4 rather than the back 5. Obviously, having wing backs is the ideal from a FPL perspective. I don't think a back 4 would necessarily kill them as options. So, obviously Cancelo and Trent play in a back 4 and they seem to be fine. Because they've priced them at 6, you can probably take a bit of a gamble on that. I expected them to be 6.5 and they weren't. And I think basically across the board, all of these premiums are probably a bit cheaper than we expected or could have been justified. So
fair enough. I've actually got Chilwell at the moment, and I think that is based off an interesting kind of notion that I thought of, and annoyingly loads of other people have thought of too when I was doing these notes. But I've kind of realised that James, because he can be an RCB as well, right centre back, and so on and so forth, he's got that sort of defensive side to his game versus Chilwell, who doesn't convince as much. I just feel like in a 4 or a 5, James is going to be the one who probably has more defensive duties. And Chilwell is probably going to be the one who is liberated from those defensive duties because of his profile as a player. So Chilwell may be the one that would always be kind of employed in that attacking way, whereas the more defensively sound James, either in a 4 or a 5, could be deployed with more defensive duties. So that could be an interesting way to poke at the current template with regard to either of them. But yeah, I agree. I think that I was surprised to see that they both got 6.0. I'm sure there'll be periods in the season when suddenly doubling up on them would be quite good. So both of them for a combined price of 12 does look like great value, really. Outside of these, though, there is one premium for whom EO may well rear its ugly head, and that is Perisic. Man my age, coming into the Premier League, a lot fitter than me, and a lot more lean than me, that's for sure. But is he, Lucy, the best thing since sliced bread?
I think he's probably simultaneously not worth the hype, but worth the spot in your team. I think he's been hyped in such a way that you'd think he was going to basically break the Premier League by scoring 20 goals or something. It's kind of got to that point of hysteria on Twitter where I think you do need to balance it off a little bit. So spoke about it briefly last time, but the fact is that Conte has a lot of wing backs at his disposal. I mean, I know Reguilón's been linked with a move, but they're also linked with Jed Spence. There seems to be quite a lot of depth in that position, so that would give Conte lots of options. Because Conte's managed Perisic before, we can kind of get an idea for how he uses him. So the good thing from an FPL perspective is that of the 24 matches he started under Conte in 2021, he was only sub before 60 in 4 of them. So you're probably going to get those clean sheet points should they exist. So that's a good thing. But the thing is, I've just said 24 games. So he's started 24 games of a full season. And I think that's entirely possible that you will see a random benching happen. That said, I think because we're in that position where we've got the extra wild card, because you can be a bit more aggressive and because you probably need to get a little foot in that Spurs attack, particularly if you don't go for Kolasevsky, I think he's probably at a price point where you can take the gamble. I just think it's good to be mindful of the fact you're going to see some issues with his minutes, particularly from a starting perspective. I don't know if that's roughly where you are, Tom, or whether you're a bit more cynical on that one.
I still need some convincing. I feel like the EO is probably going to push me there a little bit. I know he is in also pick teams as well, which is probably inflating the ownership a little bit. But there is definitely that potential for him to be Reece James Mark II. If he starts, you've got a good chance of something really going off with him. As you mentioned, and Conte was his manager. So not last year. Like last year, he was under Inzaghi, some different manager, different context. So if we're kind of tracing back to 2 years ago. But he was rotated with Ashley Bloody Young in that time. And obviously, there's very good numbers. I'm still a bit cold on him, despite knowing that. I don't know. I feel like he could be the epitome, and maybe it's just me. Maybe it's that kind of availability heuristic of remembering past game week ones. He could be the epitome of FPL Twitter FOMO, especially, you know, looking back on this sort of player coming into the Premier League. I mean, you've got his age, you've got the tax, I suppose, between the Italian league coming into the Premier League. It's a little bit different, I guess, if we're trying to kind of track from one league to the other. I'm not entirely convinced yet. I understand as well, looking at the XGI numbers, etc., why he's a good pick. I can understand as well why people are looking, especially if they're not convinced by Kolasevsky and they can't fit in Son and Kane, why he's going to be the guy who's going to be fulfilling that Spurs attack sort of role for you. I think that Kolasevsky probably is similar to him in that I suspect both are going to start game week 1. So, yeah, I think at 5.5, I think you're probably right, actually. I think maybe I should, when I do get around to it, put him back in my team just because he's one of those that you can afford to take the risks, you said. I think that's probably...
I think you've just gone on a full journey there. As
I have. But I think you're right, though. I think it's one of those where, even though I personally may not be particularly warm on him, as I said at the very start, that template is there a template for a reason. That certainly works. I'm not going to lose out by having him there. And especially if you keep 0.5 million in the bank, you're able to move him on. And the same with the Rashford point, you're on the bandwagon if that bandwagon takes off. And if you aren't with the bandwagon, then you're 2 steps behind because other people have got loads of points in the Southampton game, and you're probably going to be looking at bringing in that player before he rises. Especially if you've only got kind of 5 or 6 games until you're going to wild card anyway. It's a fine suck it and see, really, isn't it, with Perisic?
Were you a bit colder on Perisic, perhaps because you saw a bit more in the next, the 5 million next category down?
Yeah. So let's start at 5. We'll go to the 4.5s in a minute because there's a whole smorgasbord of players that go into that. At the 5, I think there are a couple that I really like. The first one actually is Gabriel Arsenal, not Gabriel Martinelli, not Gabriel Jesus, Gabriel Magalhaes. So he actually last year was 5th for shots on target among centre-backs. He had the 4th most ever chances last season, the 6th overall in terms of defenders for shots in the box, which is pretty good for a central defender. I mean, he's the target for those Odegaard corners. And given our start, as I mentioned, I really don't mind going with him to start the season with as kind of added threat, really, because I don't think Ben White quite offers that, especially because Ben White's 5'10", I think it is. But Gabriel, I think, could offer a little bit of value there. And I quite like that idea, especially if I'm going to be wildcarding game week 6, game week 7. Have those first kind of few games of him. He could really work out, and he's 0.5 million cheaper than Perisic, who may not play every single one of those kind of first 6 games. So as a kind of a medium-term pick, I think he could work. The other one is Trippier. We'll speak about a couple others maybe. Modest 5 starts last campaign, only 400 minutes because he got injured, obviously. But over 6 points per 90 in those starts, obviously a tiny sample size. But he registered 1.5 key passes per game, which is pretty decent. And he also had the set piece monopoly, which is very, very good for a cheap player. I really like that. And I can't see that changing this year. Good couple of fixtures and could be a decent pickup there as well. So those are the 2 that I like at 5. I know there's quite a few there, aren't there, Lucy, there?
Yes, there are. I think to kind of back you up on the Gabriel thing, I think I prefer him to Tierney. Tierney always gets a lot of buzz on Twitter, and I can completely understand why. His stats normally justify it, but the fact is that he always feels like a planned transfer because he's never reliably fit. So from that point of view, I prefer Gabriel just from a kind of minutes perspective. To kind of recap slightly on what you were saying on Trippier, I did see people suggesting that he was James Ward-Prowse with clean sheets. This is entirely offensive and I will not be accepting it in any way. The only other one I wanted to pick up on was the potential that you might get a bargain out of the Man City defence. So at the moment, Walker's priced at 5 million. I think people have generally given him a wide berth because Man City are also linked to another £5 million player in Cucurella, who could be gold, I think, if he gets kind of adjusted quickly, and that's my real concern there. So if he did go, I think he's the classic Pep transition player in the sense that Pep's unlikely to throw him in and start every game from the beginning. But if he can kind of establish himself and do that potentially when you're looking at a first or second wild card, I think he could be great value. He was 3rd to Trent Robertson for chances created by a full back from open play last season, and obviously is very highly rated at Brighton. So if you can do that kind of thing at Brighton, there's great potential at City. So yeah, apart from the 2 you've already said, I guess there's just one final note, which is the Villa fullbacks.
Yeah, come on, get your Luca Dean out here. Oh.
You don't want me to, do you?
No, do. Tabula rasa.
Exactly. This is exactly proving that point. I know Luca Dean has burned a lot of people a lot of times. But he still delivers good stats. He still has a great cross in him, gets a few set pieces. I think he's well worth looking at as his cash. I think those Villa fullbacks have probably been overlooked just because we've seen so much value in this tier and in all other defensive tiers. I think we're in a position probably where people would like to have 8 defenders at this rate. I know cash is quite high on the EO stakes, but Luca Digne has hardly been touched, maybe for good reason. But yes, I think that's probably the extent of that. And then of course we come to the 4.5s.
I think you probably mentioned Kyle Walker at 5 as well. As I mentioned earlier, if he does start, having double City defence at times is like printing points. But yeah, I mean, looking through the sort of list, Christensen at Leeds had a lot of shots, but 5.0 plays for Leeds. United defenders. Cucurella, yes, if he does go to City, that's probably an absolute bargain, and probably would look at him to probably pair with Cancelo. I'm not sure. I don't know. I might have him on his own, but
I don't think I could do it. I don't think I could go on his own. I think it would be a double up.
Nathan Ake to Chelsea, potentially 5.0, he could want to mention. And then you've got Cresswell, Agard, West Ham, and the Spurs defenders. I mean, they're all situational picks, aren't they, really? But yes, the 4.5s. There are more 4.5 defenders than any other category by some distance. Yep, it's absolutely ridiculous how many 4.5 defenders there are. 57% of all defenders fit into this category. This happened the last 3 or 4 years. They basically just gone, it's not amazing, but it's not terrible either. So I'm going to lump them in at 4.5 defence. And there are so many of them. So I think we'll probably need to just keep it quite short here and just kind of look at who we're actually favouring in this mix. I mean, the Arsenal kids, I get why people are interested. I think that Tomiyasu and White offer very little upside, just solid 90-minute men in a decent defence, which I suppose makes sense to look at them. They're great kind of sub ones. Johnny at Wolves been mentioned, Botman and others at Newcastle been mentioned too. I think there's probably a couple of ones that really stand out to me. The first one was the 4.5s at Leicester. So Castagna, James Justin, Ricky P, Ricky Pereira. Don't know who's going to be occupying those slots, but James Justin a few years ago had a really decent heat map, a really decent points per game average. Second one is the cat kicker himself, Kurt Zuma. I was very surprised to see him at 4.5, just because West Ham are an okay, decent-ish defence, average about kind of 9 or 10 clean sheets a year. The RSPCA's favourite could be one to think about, just because of the headed attempts he gets every year. Maybe the inheritor of Dawson's crown is the guy that you get a 10-pointer, 15-pointer out of every now and again. But for me, I think it's Dunk at 4.5. That's the most appealing. 130 to 130 points a season guy, decent goal threat, bonus potential, etc. As nailed as they come. With him, he's the one that I look through, apart from Zuma, that stood out as being, wow, I'm surprised he's 4.5. If he was 5, I wouldn't have batted an eyelid. At 4.5, I think those are the things. If Botman maybe could be like an unproven one, especially as Newcastle improve as we expect them to. But Dunk was the one alongside Zuma that I looked at and thought, okay, these are the two where I wouldn't have been surprised if they were 5 million. So I think those two probably feel the best value to me in that area. Very good first benchers. So the kind of player that you're happy to own. Centre back, know they're going to play pretty much every game and can come on for you and do a job for you, or rotate if there's a particular tricky game out there. What do you think?
I'm warmer on the Arsenal guys than you are. Arsenal are a better defence than the majority of those 4.5. So I think that attracts me as much as they don't have a significant upside. I think that can sometimes get overstated, especially when you talk about centre-backs. Yes, they might grab the odd goal, but are you necessarily going to hit that goal if you don't have them kind of for a very long period? To come back to Botman, who you just mentioned, I don't see him necessarily as a starting option because I think he's going to go through a period of adaptation. But I think the potential to look at him, if you took a kind of game week 6, 7 wild card, he's got a very good run of fixtures. After that, 3 of the kind of classic top 6 in an 11-week period. So you could have quite a nice run at him then, would also apply to Trippier, of course. So that same kind of period would also allow you to monitor Justin, Castagna, etc. I think you've probably covered the main ones there.
All right. Big category, a short section. It's just the way it is. 4.5 million defenders, because mostly
you can't get excited about them, really, can you?
Well, they're going to be crowded out unless you're going for a freemium by people being awakened to the fact they're such great value. And there'll be one area, I think, where people are going to be kind of scrabbling around. Well, maybe not so much now, because today, Nico Williams moved to Nottingham Forest. That's the 4 million defenders. 90% of the defenders cost 4 million. There are 34 of these at the time of recording. I think probably Nico Williams, maybe if Nat Phillips moves to Bournemouth, but Nico Williams probably is the one that I look at. He's not going to be an AWB, I don't think. I know he's very attacking. I suspect he's very likely to be a Brandon Williams sort of character. But with the ownership point that I mentioned earlier on, in terms of just insulating yourself against price drops, going most popular player at this point makes a lot of sense. And as an enabler as well, so saving 0.5 from the likes of Lewis Dunk or the likes of Ben White down to this guy, that 0.5 can either be stuck in your bank or it can be used to do something else elsewhere. There's not that much in terms of data for Neco last year. I admit I didn't watch Fulham last year. I'm really sorry. Rich Losman, 2 goals and 2 assists for Fulham in 14 games, 0.3 goal involvements per 90. Purely eye test. It sounds like the Fulham fans were quite complimentary about him. And it sounds like it would just be a case of just looking at, if you're going to go over 4.0, just seeing who the highest owned player is and just going with that. I think that's probably the most logical way of approaching it. What do you think?
Yeah, I think Nico Williams makes a lot of sense. I think this is probably the first season where there's potential that you've got a nailed on 4 million starter and he's not necessarily a default pick, because I think there is just so much value elsewhere. I don't think it's quite as kind of compulsory as it felt in previous seasons, because I mean the 4.5s would maybe give you something a bit more solid from a clean sheet perspective, and then also there are the people that have kind of gone premium across the full 5. So yeah, he's not potentially as default as he was before, but I think probably the reputation of Jed Spence is probably playing a little bit of a part in the Nico Williams hype, in the sense that Jed Spence was obviously quite an attacking wing back at Forest last season, isn't going to be carrying on, looks like he might go to Spurs. So there's a thought that Williams would slot into that kind of role in the team and potentially have quite a lot of attacking threat. So yeah, I think he's a perfectly fine option. I don't think there's much else in that category from what I could see, and I'm just going to prioritize someone that starts if I go down that route, really.
Yeah, I think I probably will end up going down that route. I know that it's an enabler, but equally I kind of know that come 2 or 3 days for game week 1, I'm going to be sat there thinking I need that 0.5. Sorry, Lewis, I'm going to end up with Neco.
You need the 0.5 for your bank, don't you?
Exactly. That's the logical thing to do. Right, final position is the strikers, and we're going to swap it around to end up looking at 4.5 million strikers, the bummest note you could ever end on. Let's start there instead. Strikers, 4.5 to 5. There's 13 of these. There's only 57 strikers in the game. It's not that many. Almost a quarter of them are pretty cheap in terms of 4.5 to 5. And I look at the ownership at the moment, and it looks to be Mr. Greenwood, Arsenal old boy at Leeds. I think he looks a decent pick. There's reports that Marsh actually sees him as a number 10. Says he's very talented, which encourages me a bit in terms of minutes he'll play. And I think we're still kind of waiting around for. I don't know if we're going to end up dating the pod here, Lucy, but looks like a Liam Delap Southampton move seems to be what loads of people are hanging their hat on.
Yeah, so Saints are linked to Kabore, one of their right backs, who I think actually was attracting interest from other Premier League clubs. We're linked with a loan for him or a loan for Delap. I think it's probably quite likely that we'll have a loan from one of those two, just because we're doing so much business with City this summer. We've already bought 2 of their players. So there seems quite a strong connection there. We've also got their youth recruitment guys coming to be our head of recruitment. So there's kind of clearly quite a link going on with City here. So yes, I think that's probably your best chance of getting value out of the 4.5s. And if not, then it's going to case of getting Greenwood and sort of sucking it up. I think the dearth of options here is another reason to look away from one striker up top, because I think there's so much better value from, say, Nico Williams as a budget option in the defence, or Pereira or De Silva from the midfielder position. So I think this is another reason why you probably don't go for one up top.
Yeah, so striker 2, as I said earlier on, is quite an interesting slot. And I think there's obviously the whole gamut of where you probably go with that in middle reaches. Between 5.5 and 8.5, Richarlison's actually the only 8.5 striker in the game, like Bowen is the only 8.5 midfielder. That's 67% of the strikers, 38 of these guys. And the 5.5 to kind of 6 area, I think we really need to home in on the likes of Undav, Awoniyi, Johnson and Mbuemo. Undav, to start with, I've seen him in a few teams. So worked well in Belgium, 25 goals, 9 assists for Brighton sister club Union SG, as they almost won the league last year. I think they lost on a playoff or something like that. I don't know. Could he be the man who ends Bryson and ex-Albion's playful nickname? I simply don't know. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned Slanky as well at 6. Decent in the championship last year. He's now nearly 25, so if one of those players who was forever young, but time is a creeping. 29 goals, 7 assists last season. I'm just not too sure about him either, mainly because the opening fixtures are shocking for Bournemouth, Aston Villa, Man City, Arsenal and Liverpool. Ooh, it's not good. And Scott Parker, from listening to Neil Grover on Planet FPL, seems to be making them more hard to beat basically, like Parker at Fulham. So I'm not sure about them. But Mbeumo and maybe Awoniyi are the two that I'd look at. I mean, Johnson, 16 goals sent us championship last year. Big hope of Welsh football. I think it's Mbeumo and Awoniyi who are the two. I'm very sorry if I'm mispronouncing that.
Oh, I looked it up. That is correct. Awoniyi. Yeah.
Excellent. Perfect. So the first one, Mbeumo, the carpenter, loves the woodwork. 6 times last season hitting the woodwork, equal with Rafinha.
Not a lucky man when it comes to...
No, definitely not. But that's an encouraging thing. I know people are saying, oh, that's really annoying. But that's an encouraging thing. And I also think what's worth pointing out is that with these players, the ones that we don't really know too much about, we don't really think about them in terms of their age profile, things like that. Like in my head, I thought Mbeumo was like, a 29-year-old grizzled veteran of the lower reaches of Ligue 1. But actually, he's 22. He was 23 on game week 1. And he had a better non-pair XG than Tony did last year.
I mean, it's just his underperformance that's killed him, really, isn't it?
Yeah, that's pretty good. I mean, think about Tabula Rasa, the 6.0 with decent opening fixtures. I mean, I spoke about Wissa earlier on being pretty decent, but that could be more than all right, especially with Brentford and how they play, how they set up. I mean, look at him. Awoniyi, 15 goals in the Bundesliga last year. And what was really impressive about him was he had a 50% conversion rate of shot on target to goals. So that's one to watch. Like, he's very good at making the most of having few chances. I think it was at Union Berlin last year. And he was an 88th percentile according to FBref for forwards for finishing, which is really good. So I think either one, Lucy, could be a really good kind of surprise package at the price. And you look at them, and we'll speak about kind of the more expensive forwards in just a minute, but either of them, I'm sure they probably won't be, but could be the sort of player who makes a mockery of their initial kind of cost.
Yeah, Awoniyi, that 15 goals from 29 starts seems to me to be a pretty good output, and he's done that off 14 XG, so that's pretty much in line with expectations from a statistical point of view. I think the difficulty with him is that he didn't really have consistent Bundesliga minutes in the previous season, so I had a kind of little bit of a look back at him. But the previous 2 seasons did point to the same statistical trends in terms of, per 90, so between 0.5 and 0.6. So it suggests that even when he wasn't getting minutes, he was still kind of providing threat and involvement. So I think he's the one that I'm particularly interested in the category, and he's the kind of player that could tempt me to shift structure a little bit. And Mbeumo, I'm a bit cold on. I know his XG was really good, but I think his versatility may count against him. So he's been recategorized to a striker. And I think you do see him fairly frequently not play as a striker. And that always puts me off a little bit.
Yeah, you don't want a poo asset, do you, really?
No, that's essentially what he would be, a poo. I didn't want to say it, but yeah, that's what he would be, a poo. So that's my only criticism there. I think he's probably been undervalued because of underperforming his statistics so badly, but I just don't want to get into a position where I'm looking at my striker playing in midfield. It's hard enough for cheap strikers to do well from a points perspective without them also being further away from the goal.
All right, let's move up then. So 6.5 sevens. It's Mitrovic, Welbeck and Mopé. Let's leave Welbeck and Mopé. Tony, Ings at 7. Let's leave Ings as well at this point too. But Mitrovic is probably worth mentioning quickly. I'm actually just really, really flipping glad that we've avoided the FOMO on him, because if they got an easier start, I think that he would be the subject of a frenzy of Twitter threads on why he should be in your team. It's very important to have that tabula rasa with Mitrovic, that's for sure. According to Athletic, he's got a manager again in Marco Silva who really rates him. The team is set up to play for him, unlike it was before. And there was that significant managerial change last time Fulham were in the Premier League. He's not that bad at all, actually. I mean, when he had the full season back in 2018-19, he came away with an XGI of 15 and ended up with 11 goals and 3 assists, which isn't bad at all. I suspect that at some point he'll be in mind for us, won't he, over the course of this year. I think the other one in this sort of category is Tony. I'm really not sure on Tony without Eriksen. It remains to be seen whether Josh De Silva is going to step up and replicate what Eriksen does. I'll say a lot more in Talisman Theory, which come out this week, because the last kind of 10 game weeks where he really took off, and equally those game weeks when Eriksen was playing. So I think I'd be happy if I was to kind of look at it and think, well, I might as well take the saving with Mbeumo and spend that extra million elsewhere between those two. So I think this category is one where I'm not particularly excited.
I'm with you on that one. I think it's actually replicating the same structure that we saw in the midfield. So we're quite interested in the 6 and 6.5 midfielders and the 8 midfielders. Similarly here, I think there's value in the 6 strikers and the 8, but the kind of dearth in the middle is a bit horrible. I mean, you said not to mention Ings. He only started 22 games last season, down from 26 previous season, down from 32. He got 32 in that Project Restart season. In a normal season, he's just not reliable enough. He was 1,000 minutes down on that peak last season, so just don't see him being reliable enough. I think Villa have got regrets pretty much about buying him, if we're honest. And Watkins is just $500,000 more expensive, so it's not really worth doing. Tony, I do share the same reservations. I think it's probably just worth pointing out that between decent fixtures and penalties, he might turn out okay, but it's just not enough to entice me. Which brings us, therefore, to Watkins, Bamford, Wilson, the 7.5s. I know when we last spoke, you were quite hot on Wilson, Tom. Has that changed?
Basically, I think having 2 forwards is a good idea. I think that probably one of the 8.0s has a better shout than Wilson does, just about. But I think the 7.5s, Wilson probably is the main man in that sort of area. Bamford's overpriced, frankly. I mean, he was very close to 200 clubs 2 years ago. The whole of the Bielsa system was set up to service him. Very, very good year 2 years ago, like ridiculously good. It's just whether that was an annus mirabilis or not. Watkins, we've spoken about a second ago, he's like the guy who seems to be trusted by Gerrard. I think Antonio as well in this slot. Started very well last season as well, was the man to own for a while. But talking about Wilson, 5 points per game last season. I think he's just a perpetual threat at any club, I think. I mean, he's got that knack of scoring goals in games like versus Chelsea comes to mind for some reason. And he's always kind of steady pick. I think having a player like him or 0.5 million more like Jesus makes a lot of sense, that's for sure. And not throwing the baby up the bathwater when it comes to strikers, especially what we said last week in terms of looking at the strikers and not getting too carried away with how they were terrible last season makes a lot of sense to me, at least. And with Eddie Howe managing the team, Wilson established as number 9. Chris Woods, I'm sure, was a pure banter transfer. I think looking at the ownership as well, at the moment, 3% or something, those 2 really good starting fits for Newcastle could be a very interesting pick to start the season on penalties as well. So if you're looking at 7.5, you haven't got 0.5 to get up to Jesus, who we're going to speak about in just a sec, I think that Wilson would probably be your man.
Yes, he certainly would be for me. I can't make a compelling case for any of the other 7.5s. And it's just a question whether you need that $500,000. It might be that Nico Williams now gives you a $500,000 that you can use to upgrade to the 8 millions. Speaking of the 8 millions, I think we can pretty much skip over DCL, given that Everton have got significant financial issues and are unlikely to make big moves to strengthen their attack. They've obviously lost Richarlison, that's going to kind of weaken that as well. So that brings you to Jesus and Havertz. I think Jesus is probably the big surprise since we last spoke because we didn't know the price at that point. 8 million is cheaper than expected. And I think there's plenty in his kind of statistical background to suggest that he could be really good. His stats at City were very good last season. So we're looking at 0.71 XGI per 90. And he's kind of historically delivered some pretty stupendous figures. 1920 he did very well, but that was undermined by kind of quite a poor conversion rate. And I think there's probably been quite a lot of probably overstated criticism about his finishing ability. But I think if he can hold down his place up top, he could be a really good option. He's in my draft at the moment.
With Jesus, I think you're right. He was a surprise when he came in at 8. And as many have noted, he had a very, very good record at Man City. I think it's an average of 0.75 goals or assists per 90 while he was there. And now it is a case of which one it was with him. Was it Man City having the most creative midfield in Europe, which was giving him chances? Or was it that Jesus, the player himself, was getting in positions to make those chances be convertible into good stats, if not amazing returns? I don't know the answer, but 8.0 is a very, very good opening price. I did say earlier I was looking at Saka, but I think that Jesus just about takes it from him. And he said himself as well, I know we shouldn't place too much prominence on player interviews. He sees himself as number 9, Jesus getting on the end of crosses and things like that. Ludicrous value, potentially. And it just feels like he's got that toxic mix of being one of the highest owned players, being a known quantity, having good fixtures and being desperate to impress. As I said ages ago, the template isn't a bad thing. And I think that Jesus falls into what you were saying about Perisic a little bit, Lucy, that you don't really lose out too much by just going with that at the start of the season. He did do a couple of goals against Nuremberg, so he got through that particular trial. I mean, what do you think about Jesus? Is he the guy that you're currently backing in this second striker slot?
Yes, I do have him in at the moment. I think he's probably fairly nailed on. The only thing I did discuss was potentially going down to a 6 so that I could upgrade a midfielder up to an 8. It's back to that kind of same flip-flop between 6s and 8s. I think he obviously isn't, as you kind of said, isn't going to get the same chances that he would have got at City, but he's also going to get a lot more starts and a lot more minutes, you'd have thought. So I think that might counteract that to a certain extent. I think the other person in the category is Havertz, whose stats are actually really good. It's just that he never really gets enough starts. So he's only started 18 in the previous season and 22 last season, with 1,800 minutes in the league last season. Obviously, Lukaku leaving might increase that.
Yeah.
But that's quite concerning. I mean, that's only 250 minutes more than someone like, I don't know, Eduard, who is a pretty rotation freak. So he's not really shown me so far that he can really provide the starts and expected minutes that I'd want from that kind of investment.
Yeah, I mean, it will take me a bit of time before I can trust him again, that's for sure. But moving him to a striker makes a lot of sense. I just thinking about how he played when he was at Leverkusen, that's for sure. I wonder whether you're going to kind of see him provide that sort of room for Sterling to work. I think that that's going to be probably the biggest thing. Thinking about how he and Moussa Diaby sort of used to work together, a lot of the time it was about Havertz playing that Firmino role, dragging the defender and allowing the inside forward to cut in. I just wonder whether that's going to be replicated with Sterling. Lots of things have been said about Tuchel, like pointing out how he thinks that Sterling's going to fit into his team. I think a lot of that's going to be really contingent on how Havertz plays in that team. As we saw last year with how Havertz played in that team, yes, he was capable of getting those goals and getting into threatening areas, but I think a lot of the time this year it's going to suit him perhaps to have another player like Sterling who's going to take the mantle, and for him to be that sort of provider, if not in the stats, then in the movement. 8 million still could be decent. Like Firmino back in the day was very decent for that price if he did get on a little goal scoring stint. So I can see him eventually at times attacking the template, but I think that it's going to be Jesus at the start of the season. Let's face it, 8 million. I think that he makes a lot of sense. Final thing is the premium strikers. Ronaldo, Vardy, feasibly not needing rotation earlier in the season. Iheanacho and Daka still there and ended the last season very well. Could the old warhorse be worth our while? And Liverpool strikers before we get double digits. Jota and Darwin, I think both of them are a wait and see. I wouldn't be surprised to see Jota start game week 1. I feel like those players are all very situational. Like with Vardy, I'd be much more interested in looking at Maddison, maybe Barnes. With Ronaldo, 100%, I'd be looking at Bruno if I was a Man United fan, and looking at including a Man United player, unless I was a Ronaldo fanboy, in which case you're probably not listening to the podcast at this point, let's be fair. And Liverpool strikers, you've got Mo Salah, you've got Luis Diaz, you've got great options at the back. I don't think there's much interest there. But I think the biggest thing really here is Haaland or Kane. I've seen a few people saying, leave Haaland for the West Ham game, see what happens. Get Kane in for the Southampton game and swap him over for that Bournemouth game in game week 2 when you've got massive FOMO. I don't think either of us can go about Haaland at this point. I'll be really loosey, barring injury in pre-season or something like that.
I think we kind of covered it at the beginning of the pod, but yeah, Haaland's pretty nailed in for me. Kane, I think there is reason for him. If he's a different way of going through that kind of freemium structure we're talking about, you didn't necessarily have to go with Son. I think Kane is also a viable option, but I just don't think that I can see passing up Haaland for Kane. I think it also points to the idea that planning in transfers, as discussed, I've seen a few people mention that plan you just said. I think planning in transfers on premiums at the beginning of the season is not a good idea. I think you've got the luxury of the extra wild card, so you can be a bit more aggressive at the beginning of the season, but I don't think that should involve planning in transfers. It should mean that, you can dead end a team maybe if you'd like to into 5 or 6, but I think planning in transfers and kind of thinking, I'll swap between this premium and that premium, I just wouldn't do it, because it so limits your ability to leap on those kind of bandwagons and all of that kind of stuff we discussed. It's like this distraction that that you've got to restructure your team. So I really wouldn't do that. If you want to go with Kane as a premium striker, you just need to commit to it.
I was talking about this in the behavioural science pod, but the novelty effect versus ambiguity bias. I mean, novelty dictates we want the shiny new toy, versus ambiguity, which dictates we stick with what we know in confusing times. But Haaland and the hype means that he's currently the number one pick for many people, that's for sure. Or joint number one, maybe with Salah in Sunderland. But I think that in different game week 1 to West Ham is kind of something you can ride out. And that game week 2 versus Bournemouth is going to be, that EO for that, the FOMO for that is going to be absolutely huge. I'm not going to extol Erling Haaland's data here. We all know it, or at least have a modicum of an idea about what it is. But I think overlooking Kane perhaps is something that you might do at your peril. I'm sure there'll be a few people game week 1 who just kind of think, I'm not going to overlook the proven quantity. There's loads of kind of very, very good examples from last year, year before that, of people who have just gone, you know what, I'm not getting anyone new. I'm just getting the tried and trusted guys. And that makes complete sense. And as you said, the freemium probably could be the way around that. So going with a Son or a Kane, plus Haaland and Salah. If Salah's untouchable, you could maybe kind of look at a Haaland or Kane and having something like that. The EO, I know I hate to talk about it, but probably is going to be the one that would mean most people end up with Erling. It's difficult, or it's not that difficult, actually. I think we all kind of pretend it's difficult, and we know we should be thinking about Kane, but I think that Haaland is going to be the one that we end up with, basically, in the premiums, and I can't really see that changing. I know the ownership now is kind of 60% plus. Can't see that declining, really, just because you've got the hype factor, plus the fact that he's genuinely a very, very good player.
I like at the beginning of this pod, we were like, oh, we're not going to go into ownership too much. And yet we keep being like, now, because of effective ownership, you should probably just own this player. It's just about being sensible and not taking unnecessary risks. We've discussed quite a lot of different options for the lower tier categories where you can take a few gambles and a few risks. But in these premium categories, I think you just need to cover off the bases and make sure that you're not miles behind after a few game weeks, which is what can happen if you try to gamble against the herd too early.
I agree. Well, I think that we've managed to do it, Lucy. I think that's all 4 positions covers. I think that's probably your lot. Hopefully that was useful. It took bloody ages to research, but I truly enjoyed doing that and doing this pods. So yeah, hopefully there'll be a gem or two for you in there. We'll talk about the structural stuff. We touched on a bit as the season draws closer. We reach the beginning of August. But yes, thank you very much for listening.
Yes, thanks everyone for sticking through that whirlwind tour. I think we've hopefully given you something to think about and where to position your risks. We were Who Got the Assist at WGTA_FPL, or you can find me at Lucy Hynett with 2 T's. If you enjoyed listening to this, please like and subscribe to the podcast. For new listeners out there, if you think you'll be coming back, please hit that 5-star rating across platforms like iTunes and Spotify so more people can enjoy the pod.
Yep, thanks very much indeed. Do go ahead and do that. We hope you enjoyed this. We hope it assisted you. And we'll speak to you again very, very soon. This week, Talisman Theory is also coming out, I should mention, via All About FPL on Thursday. And then next week, it's the start of our summer specials with FPL and Behavioural Science. And the week after that, it will be FPL and ITKs. We'll be back with a proper pod again before game week 1 to reflect on where we are, talk about structural stuff, how we're setting up, and yeah, just how we're going to go about attacking game week 1 of 2022-2023. Speak very soon. Goodbye.
Oh, it's a goal. Who got the assist? Who got the assist?